So welcome to the Humanities Center today. Following sessions in which we considered the literary and artistic qualities of the city, we now turn to a consideration of how the idea of the city has been used by philosophers and other thinkers in their work. And joining me to discuss this today are two esteemed colleagues from the College of Arts and Sciences. Tim Wyman McCarty received his PhD from Brandeis University and is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations. He has published work on the idea of complicity in democratic politics, political thought in the work of Vladimir Nabokov, right-wing politics in America, and is co-editor with Sabine von Mehring of Right-Wing Radicalism Today, Perspectives from Europe and the US, published by Routledge in 2013. He's currently at work on two book-length projects, one on the relationship between taxation and citizenship in democratic thought and practice, and the other on the politics of complicity, tentatively titled The Tragedy of Complicity. Turner Nevitt is a specialist in the field of medieval philosophy. He received his PhD from Fordham University and is Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy. God bless it. He's authored a substantial number of papers on the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, a not inconsiderable number of which are focused on survivalism and corruptionism in Aquinas. With the great Brian Davis, Dr. Nevitt produced an edition of Aquinas' previously untranslated text, The Quodlibetal Questions. Published by Oxford University Press in 2019, this new translation has been much lauded, with the European Journal for the Study of Thomas Aquinas praising its high quality. I quote, "Other modern languages should follow the level of translation achieved in this work," its review declared.
I've not read that review.
Really? That's lovely. In today's session, we'll hear first from Dr. McCarty. His thoughts will, and we have a fourth speaker. We'll hear first of all from Dr. McCarty, whose thoughts will relate to ancient thinking, ancient ideas of the classical world. With Dr. Nevitt's contribution, we'll move into the world of medieval ideas, and then I'll just say a brief word about two 20th century thinkers. So, Dr. McCarty, first of all, over to you.
Thank you. I'm quite short. Thank you, everyone, for coming here to listen to us talk, hopefully sensibly, about the city in philosophy and whatnot. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tim McCarty, and I am an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations. I believe it says that behind me, so I didn't need to say so out loud. I was asked by Brian to give this talk about the idea of the city in Plato, and I immediately said yes. And then immediately started panicking because I didn't know what it is that I had to say about Plato and the city. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to share with you how I've been trying to get my head around what Plato says about the city and how I think it can help us think about our cities. So if you know anything about Plato and the city, you probably know, you are familiar with the fact that he famously wrote a couple of books in which he has characters have complex dialogues where they imagine up imaginary, wonderful cities, the most famous of which is The Republic, the book that I tell all of my students when we finish reading it in class that they should put it under their pillow and sleep with it there every night so that it will be a friend for them for life. And then also Plato's Laws, which is probably his least popular book. And that has not stopped two of my colleagues and I from teaching a seminar about it this semester, because we're nothing if not bold. So most folks who have read these books, even folks who have just heard about these books, tend to assume that the cities Plato writes about represent his political ideal, that he's laid out these cities, and this is what he would like to see happen in the world. And that he wants, that if he had his druthers, the laws, the institutions, the practices of these imaginary cities would come into being. And I think all of these people are wrong. And I tend to agree with the political theorist Leo Strauss, who, citing Cicero, declares, "The Republic does not in fact present the best political order, but rather brings to light the limitations, the limits, and therewith the nature of politics." In other words, the purpose of Plato writing about a city is not that he wants us to build a city of the sort that he writes about, but that he wants us to think more deeply about our own cities, what it means to live in a political community. That's what I think these books are more fundamentally about. I don't think Plato was a utopian. I don't think Plato was a totalitarian, as he has been accused of being by a lot of his readers, most famously the philosopher Karl Popper. But I also don't think he was a democrat. He did not love democracy, despite the fact that he lived in an ancient democracy, most notably because his ancient democracy, ancient Athens, killed his teacher, Socrates. And that was something he thought was a bad idea. But I think he was a pluralist. And that's the argument that I'm going to attempt to persuade you of today. I think the implicit question at the heart of all of Plato's political philosophy is, how should we try to live in a deeply imperfect political regime, in a deeply imperfect city? And one answer that a lot of folks tend to attribute to Plato, to that question, we look around, we see an imperfect city, and they think, well, I know what we should do. We should create an ideal city. We should take our city and make it better. Again, I don't think that's exactly what he was up to. Another answer, and I think it's important to see that these are the two answers he's existing between. Another answer to the question of what we should do when we find ourselves in an unjust city is that we should just meet the tenor of our times. If you can't beat them, join them. Why are we trying so hard to be good in a city that is rewarding wickedness? Why try to be just in unjust times? A truly clever philosopher should know that all these old norms and ideals are just made up anyway. So use your cleverness, seek what advantage you can. If you live in wicked times, the road to prosperity and success is the wicked one. That is also not what Plato is up to. And I think to understand what Plato is up to, you have to understand that these are the two poles that he's moving in between. And so I think what he was trying to do is help us figure out how to be good people at a time and place that doesn't reflect or validate that goodness. That's what I think he's up to. You see, Plato was living through, I'm going to move these books because they're getting in my way. They're just props. That's the only reason I have them here. If I need to pick them up, I will. You see, Plato was living through the decline of a once great and powerful democratic regime, and his philosophy reflects his attempts to cope with that experience. In his lifetime, Plato experienced the humiliating defeat of Athens in the Peloponnesian War, two separate oligarchic coups, which were followed by civil wars that restored democracy, and then the trial and execution of his teacher Socrates for having supposedly corrupted young men like Plato. In other words, Plato was living in a democracy that was in pretty bad shape. I'm sure none of you can relate to that. Now, this is the context in which he wrote the Republic. And I want to make really clear, at no point in the Republic does Socrates say that he would like to see the city come into being. Readers merely presume that because Plato has him describe the city. He must therefore want the city to come into being. Of course, he also does not say that he doesn't want the city to come into being. So in the absence of an explicit denunciation, readers draw their own conclusions. I am going to suggest to you there are different conclusions we should draw. The Republic, as those of you who have read it know, is a book depicting a long conversation between Plato's teacher Socrates and a group of young men. They're at the house of an old rich man named Cephalus. And one of the young men, a guy named Glaucon, who happens to be Plato's brother, challenges him. And he says, Socrates, something's been bothering me about the way people talk about justice. They always talk about justice like it's a drag. Like it's something a person does reluctantly. We don't act justly because it's what we want to do. We act justly because, what we really want to do? Whatever we want and get away with it. But we can't, and we don't want to suffer the punishment. And we don't want everyone else to behave the way they want and try to get away with it. So let's just all agree we're going to have a boring time and be good. And Glaucon says that's not very satisfying. He says to Socrates, I want you to persuade me that living the life of a person who is truly just is happier than the life of a person who is unjust. And to make it really stick, I want you to prove to me that if the person who is truly just, like truly in their heart, they're a good person, but nonetheless, for whatever reason, everything in their society works against them. They face adverse consequences, they suffer persecution, everybody hates them, even though they're good. Nothing works out right for them, but they continue being golden-hearted and good. Now contrast that with a person who is the wickedest possible person you can imagine, and for whatever reason, they have a sterling reputation and everything works out for them. Glaucon says to Socrates, I want you to prove to me that the man who is good and yet suffers unrelentingly is nonetheless happier than the man leading the life of what he calls successful injustice. And so this is the challenge that Socrates sets up. And what I want you to see here is that if someone's going to be persuaded that living a life of justice, regardless of adverse consequences, is still the right way to live, they have to be persuaded that a happy life does not depend on the circumstances of the external world aligning with your desires. To even make this argument right, you have to presume it doesn't depend on your city being a good place. And this is the first clue to me that Socrates is not trying to persuade us to bring about this just city. It wouldn't make any sense in the context of this argument. Happiness can't depend on creating a perfectly just city if Socrates is to meet Glaucon's challenge. If a person's going to be persuaded that they should lead a life of justice, even if the circumstances of the external world don't validate that life, it doesn't make sense to persuade them to focus their efforts on creating a world that would validate that life. It wouldn't make any sense for that to be the moral of this story. If you are a good person in a wicked city, your goodness will not only fail to be rewarded, but may in fact lead you to suffer persecution. So why should we persist in being good in an unjust world? That's the argument. Now, I want to be clear. This is why I doubt that Plato wants us to bring about his city. But readers always read the Republic and they say, well, he must want us to bring about this city. He sure does talk about a lot of things in the city. Why would he spend so much time talking about the city if he doesn't want it to come about? And I think you could ask a similar question. If George Orwell didn't think Big Brother was cool, why would he write so much about him? If Margaret Atwood didn't want to live in Gilead, why would she have written The Handmaid's Tale? If Flannery O'Connor, the great Catholic novelist, didn't think being a criminal and a nihilist was good, why did she write all her stories about them? And call me crazy, but I think that maybe you can write about things you don't like. And that's what I think is happening here. I think it's not that complicated if you take seriously the possibility that Plato's trying to teach us something about how we desire to respond to injustice. And there's a ton of textual evidence for the argument that neither the author Plato nor the character Socrates are in favor of trying to construct their imaginary city in the real world. I would be happy to share that with all of you. But I will tell you this. I've been reading this book every semester and dragging students through it, and I am increasingly convinced that he builds a city and then explains to the young men in the conversation, not only is this city impossible, But if it did come into being, it would be terrible. And not only would it be terrible, it would be terrible for people like us. And this seems weird if you know anything about the city in Plato's Republic, because in the city of Plato's Republic, it's supposed to be ruled by philosopher kings. Well, isn't this then therefore the thing that Plato must want? Plato's a philosopher. It must want to be ruled by philosopher kings. But of course, the thing that everyone forgets, and I hope that my friends Brian and Turner will back me up on this, there is nothing a philosopher wants to do less than be in charge of people. That is why it is so hard to persuade a philosopher to be chair of the philosophy department. And Mark, you're doing God's work in this regard. Of course philosophers don't want to be in charge. What philosophers want to do is be philosophizing. The only thing that could possibly be more miserable than a philosopher suffering persecution is a philosopher being in charge of the city. And this becomes very clear in the Republic as they are describing what it means to be the philosopher king. The young men say, "Boy, Socrates, it really sounds like this is no fun for us." And he keeps saying, "Well, it's not about you, it's about the city." And they keep saying, okay, I guess. And things get worse and worse. And the more you read it, the more you see the things that all the critics of Plato have ever seen, which is that this is a city full of censorship. This is a city full of strict hierarchies that are maintained through complex lies. This is a city in which everyone is deprived of a private family and private property. This is a city in which there is a complex system of eugenics. And then, to put the capper on it, Socrates says, well, if any of this is going to work, we'd have to kill or exile everyone over the age of 10. At which point, some interpreters read this and they go, gosh, I don't think Plato noticed that this is not a good idea. And my thought is, I don't know, he's the founder of Western philosophy. Maybe he noticed. Maybe it occurred to him that this wasn't a good idea. So, if this is not what Plato wants, if Plato doesn't want us to bring about his city, then why is he talking so much about a city in this book? If that's not what he wants. I don't think this is exclusively a satire. I don't think this is exclusively a dystopian. He's not writing 1984. He's not writing Idiocracy, right? These are different kinds of stories. What I think he is trying to show us is that if you start with the challenge that he gets from Glaucon and Adeimantus, the challenge he gets, these are the young men who challenge him, for those of you who don't remember. These two men challenge him and they say, show me that I can be happy being just, even if the world is crazy. And that pushes Socrates to talk about a city, because we have to ask ourselves, well, what kind of city are they living in that rewards injustice and punishes justice? And what kind of people admire a perfectly unjust person and despise a perfectly just person? And most importantly, I think for our purposes is, what does it feel like to have to live alongside an unjust person prospering despite or even because of their wickedness? And what we realize is that is the most galling thing in the world. When you know, I am doing my best to be good and nothing is working out, and here this guy goes, doing everything wrong, and he just keeps getting away with it. Nothing is more infuriating. Nothing is more upsetting than that. The problem of politics, and thus the problem of justice for Socrates, is other people not doing what they're supposed to do. That's why we have politics, because other people persist in doing whatever they want as opposed to doing what I want them to do. This is why politics is frustrating. This is the reason it is frustrating to lead a life of justice, because you cannot depend on other people to know the truth or to do the right things. And sometimes, even if you know what is right and do what is right, they will tell you you are wrong. And sometimes they will have the power to impose unpleasant consequences on you as a result of their incorrect judgment. And even more frustratingly, while you are being unjustly punished for doing what you know is right, you look across the street and someone who is an absolute scoundrel is being praised and rewarded for doing the things you know that should be condemned. In the unjust city, the good guys suffer and the bad guys prosper. So again, why shouldn't we either blow up the unjust city and make the perfect city, or give up on trying to be good? This is the challenge. Now, Socrates doesn't say so explicitly, but the temptation he's playing with when he and his friends are building their city in speech is the temptation to blow everything up and rebuild things based on their own designs. It's a cautionary tale to those of us who think we're smarter than the average bear. The academics, the intellectuals, the experts, the eggheads, the professional knowers of stuff. We look around and we say, this is terrible. Wouldn't it be better if everybody just listened to me? And Socrates builds his city in speech to explain that even if you had the most perfectly wise philosophers in charge of ordering everything in line with perfect justice, it would still be miserable and dangerously unstable. Socrates describes the city, and he gets to book 7 of the Republic. And then all of a sudden he turns to book 8, and the first thing that happens is it collapses. It collapses quickly. And the reason it collapses is because they have tried to control an uncontrollable force. The uncontrollable force that they have tried to control is eros, the force of love. They have tried to control how people love and what people will love. And that is something that cannot be controlled by political institutions. And he then describes a series of cities that collapse. First, there's a city run by soldiers. Then there's a city run by rich people. Then there's a democracy. And when the democracy collapses, it ends up in the worst possible city, a tyranny. And every city he describes collapses because the emergent ruling class is aggrieved that what matters most to them is not what matters most to their city. And so they destroy the prevailing order, not in the interest of justice, but in the interest of self-validation. They want to be the cool kids. They want to construct a city in which what they value is what everyone values. What they love is what everyone loves. They want what matters to them to be the organizing principle of the city. When the soldiers take charge, it becomes a warlike city. When the rich folks take charge, it becomes a money-making city, etc., etc. The story of Socrates' picture of the city in this way is a story about what's wrong with attempting to impose unity on a thing that is fundamentally pluralistic, the city. The city will never abide unity or uniformity. The city is necessarily pluralistic. And so what I think we can see here is that Plato ends up affirming the value of pluralism. Now, Plato is not a Democrat. Plato doesn't love democracy, neither does Socrates. There seems to be no reason to believe they exult in the grandeur of democratic government, of popular self-rule, of the wisdom of the people in their collective capacity, etc., etc. All of that stuff seems unpleasant and maybe even unwise to them. But Plato is a pluralist, and his recognition that pluralism only flourishes in democratic society makes him a reluctant, but nonetheless consistent and coherent friend to democracy. Again, he's not a Democrat, but he's an ally. Even more so, what he helps us see is why we should still defend democracy even when it is failing us at every turn, just like it failed him again and again. And the reason a Platonist might want to be favorably disposed toward democracy is pretty straightforward. Of all the cities Socrates describes, the only one that is likely to tolerate somebody like him is a democracy. And of course we know, I don't say it's guaranteed to tolerate him. They didn't. They killed him. But in each of the other cities, soldiers, oligarchs, tyrants, somebody gets things organized to validate them as the best kind of person. Only in a democracy does everyone have to accept that nobody gets to be validated as the best kind of person. It's chaotic. Sometimes a person like you gets to feel cool. Most of the time, you'll feel disoriented and a little bit alienated from the spirit of the times. If you can find a way to structure your soul so as not to rage against that disorientation and alienation, you will avoid harboring a desire to reconstruct your city in a way that puts you at the center of it all. Raging at the disorientation and alienation of your city is what causes a politics of resentment that leads to violence and civil war. This is what does it for each regime that he says collapses. Resentments not being honored, and those resentments becoming violent. The disorientation of democracy is also what causes its downfall. But what I want you to see is that the most dangerous enemies of democracy are those who want to turn the city into just one kind of thing. And they always do the same thing. They narrow the scope of what it means to be a part of the people. The people must share particular characteristics. They must believe similar things. They must all speak the same official language. They must love and hate the same things. They must enjoy the same kinds of pleasures, suffer from the same kinds of pains. And what Socrates ends up arguing is that both for a just person and a just city, recognizing that we are going to love different things is essential to flourishing and to stability. What makes the person he describes as the most perfectly just and wise person, wise and happy, is that they attend to each distinct part of their soul. All of us love many different things. There's nobody who only loves wisdom. There's nobody who only loves honor. There's no one who only loves victory. There's no one who only loves money. There's no one who only loves pleasure. We all love each of these things. Any attempt to purely isolate any one of these things and make them the sole organizing principle of our lives is destined to fail and to make us miserable, and the same is true of the city. Any attempt to make any one of those principles the sole consideration will fail and will make us miserable. This is why I think Plato's a pluralist. And I think it helps us to make sense of his interest in writing dialogues, which necessarily elevate voices other than his own. It also helps to unify Socrates' skepticism, humility, and his gregariousness. You see, Socrates loves his city, but he's got a weird way of showing it. He showed it by being the most irritating man in Athens. In fact, he proudly described himself as a gadfly, a fly that bites horses. And I think it's a weird choice if I were arguing for my life to say, you should love me, I'm like a mosquito. But that's what he did. But what I want you to see is Socrates never met a peculiar specimen of humanity he didn't want to talk to. This man loved the variety of human minds and temperaments he encountered in democratic Athens. The one thing he couldn't stand was encountering the kind of person who believed they had it all figured out, which is to say, someone who didn't think they have something to learn from other people. The kind of person who assumes that they have something to learn from their encounter with others, particularly by taking seriously the question of what they think and why they think that way, is a pluralist. And the key feature of the democratic city is its plurality. So, Socrates gives us both a negative and a positive reason to support the plurality of a democratic city. The negative reason is that he's convinced that when a democracy collapses, what we don't get is a virtuous and orderly republic. What we get is a tyranny. At the risk of pushing it too far, every moral panic and every reactionary movement I have experienced in my lifetime is a reaction to the fears and resentments that emerge in a pluralistic society. And there's no greater avatar for pluralism than these decadent cities we live in. This is why fascists always elevate the simple values of the virtuous and simple country folk over the decadent and depraved city folk. This is also why Stalinists and Maoists sought to violently crush dissent and coercively impose unity. The positive reason to embrace pluralism is that, and not just pluralism, but pluralism in a democracy, is that a democratic society is the only one that can coherently embrace pluralism. Not because individual Democrats are themselves dedicated pluralists, but because pluralism is the only way of thinking that can make sense of the chaotic nature of life in a democratic city. In other words, pluralists like Plato and Socrates and me need democracy in order to be able to flourish. And democracy needs pluralists like us to survive. That's all I've got.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Brian, for the invitation to return to the Humanities Center. I've not spoken here for some years. Brian asked me to speak about St. Augustine's City of God, his greatest work. I immediately said yes and immediately regretted it. I don't think I've approached any talk in my life with more dread and trepidation, actually. I feel very unequal to the task of talking about Augustine's City of God. Here it is, and in 20 minutes. So I would beg your indulgence, please, if you are bothered by anything I say, please don't attribute it to Augustine, but his lowly and incapable expositor. So Augustine's City of God, St. Augustine, he lived from 354 to 430 AD. He wrote the City of God in maybe the last 20 years of his life. Probably 15 of those 20 years he was writing the City of God, so an enormous work written over a very long span of time. It's a work of Christian apologetics, also one of Christian social and political philosophy. It also offers a Christian theory of history and much besides. It was occasioned by the sack of Rome in the year 410. This horrified the ancient world. For ancient Romans, the gods were supposed to protect the city of Rome, and the key to Roman success was its divine favor earned by right worship of the gods. Thus, Rome was the city of God, and yet it had been sacked by barbarians. So traditionalists of Rome blamed the sack of the city on Christians and their God to whom they had turned the city. So they urged that Romans should abandon this new Christian religion and return to the right worship of the gods. At the same time, you have religious pagan philosophers who are also opposed to the Christian ideals and pursued a different kind of approach to human life and happiness. They thought that happiness was attainable on earth by human efforts. But even they thought that this involved a kind of ritual purification of the soul by ordinary pagan piety. In other words, traditional Roman religion. So it's in response to criticism from these two groups of people that Augustine writes The City of God in defense of Christianity. His basic contention is that Rome is not the city of God. It's a merely earthly and human city, but that there is indeed a city of God, but of a different order altogether. So against these traditionalists, he argues that the pagan gods are powerless. Rome's greatness had other sources, not divine favor, but different virtues like the incredible discipline of its people or the courage of its soldiers, for example. Rome's fall wasn't due to Christianity. All you have to do is look at previous calamities that had befallen the city. The gods didn't protect it then. That had nothing to do with Christianity. And anyway, the pagan gods don't even exist, or if they do, Augustine argues, they're all demons, and they lead human beings to evil and to vices. What he's trying to do is to unmask Rome's vices, you might say, okay, and to give a true picture of ancient Rome. He argues that the city never had justice within it and never exercised justice towards those outside of it. in its dealings with other people, it was just as bad as a band of robbers, only bigger and stronger, right? Instead of a pirate ship, it was an entire fleet, but just as greedy and covetous, only on a bigger scale. Yes, the Romans extolled courage and self-sacrifice and devotion to their country, but they did this all for the attainment of a merely earthly good, human glory, honor, the desire to excel, indeed the lust to dominate. He argues they had no true love of virtue or a true desire to serve their fellows or to promote the common good. Even the pagan philosophers, such as Plato, of whom we were just hearing, admitted that no city in the world was just. The evil of men prevents it, right? And these philosophers, by proposing the eminent desirability of perfect human justice, but demonstrating its practical impossibility, show the limitations of philosophy in attaining human justice. It shows the limitations of any merely human effort or human wisdom in attaining perfect human justice. And so the ancient philosophers, Augustine argues, prove the need for some kind of higher and truer form of justice. You might think this is unattainable. I mean, that's what a later thinker like Machiavelli will think, that this is unattainable. We should lower our goal for human activity. We should lower the standard for political endeavor. In a sense, Augustine suggests something similar, but not quite. In fact, he thinks that there is a higher source of justice. There's a higher remedy for human evil, but it's not something attainable by human effort. It has to be received as a gift from above. In other words, a gift of grace. So, a basic outline of the City of God as a book. In the first 5 books, you get the defense of Christianity against the pagan political objections, those traditionalists of the Roman city I was mentioning. Books 6 through 10, you get a defense of Christianity against philosophical and religious objections coming from these different ancient philosophical schools, the eudaimonists, who thought human happiness was attainable in this life by human efforts. Then in books 11 through 14, you get this account of 2 different cities, the city of God and the earthly city or city of man. He recounts its origins in these books, 11 through 14. In 15 through 18, he gives you a history of these 2 cities, their life story, as it were. And in 19 through 22, the end of the book, he gives you an account of the end of these 2 cities, not just their destiny, where they're headed, but also their fulfillment, their kind of ultimate completion or perfection in the highest good that they aim at and achieve by their actions, all right? And this includes a discussion of judgment, heaven, and hell. It's a basic breakdown of the entire book. Okay. What I want to talk about now is the doctrine of the 2 cities. So Augustine discusses the city of God, a community of virtue, and the earthly city, or the city of man, a community of vice. You have to realize that these cities are not places, but people. They're not to be identified with any particular city or kingdom on earth. The city of God isn't to be identified even with the church, all right? It's not a particular city. They're called a city by analogy, by a kind of extension. To talk of the city of God and the earthly city is a way of saying that there are only 2 kind of human societies on earth, right? And every group of people will consist either of members of the city of God or of the city of man. But they can be intermixed. So what makes one a member of one city or the other? It's about the ultimate end that a person pursues with all of their actions. So what's the ultimate goal or end to which all of your deeds are subordinated as a means to that end, all right? This is what distinguishes membership in the city of God from the city of man. So the city of God is made up of the true followers of Jesus Christ who worship the one and true God. They live a life of pious obedience to the word of God, a life of grace received as a gift, lived in faith, hope, and love of God first of all and above all, and then love of neighbor as oneself. This, Augustine thinks, is the only true place of justice on earth. One reason being that justice, Augustine argues, is a matter of giving to each person their due, and the true God is due worship. So there can be no justice in the city of Rome, for example, because they worshipped false and lying gods. They didn't worship the true God, and so they had no true justice in their city. The end or the goal of the city of God is the enjoyment of an immutable good, one that would perfectly satisfy human longings, and the enjoyment of it with the certainty of never losing it. Augustine doesn't think that we can be happy in the enjoyment of any good that we might still lose. So the city of God longs for the enjoyment of a perfect, infinite, and immutable good that it can have with certainty of never losing it. Thus, you can only enjoy this kind of good, he thinks, in another life, in the afterlife, not in this life. Nevertheless, there is a kind of happiness possible in this life through a life of virtue enabled by grace. It's not a life of everlasting peace. It's not peace in everlasting life, but it is a life that enables you to use this life in order to attain such an everlasting peace. So, by comparison to this everlasting peace, this peace and everlasting life, Augustine claims that our lives here, however good, are most miserable. He thinks that however many goods of body we enjoy, even the most able and the most beautiful bodies, however many goods of mind that we enjoy, the most capable and brilliant minds, however many goods of fortune and circumstance that we enjoy, the richest and wealthiest and most comfortable, none of these goods can be enjoyed without the shadow of contingency. All of these goods that we enjoy can be lost, and by anyone, and at a moment, all of a sudden. Those most able-bodied can be suddenly terribly injured, attacked, right? Illness can strike them and ravage their bodies. The mind and its abilities can be lost to injury, decay, madness, senility. Your circumstances can change radically by unaccountable deeds of Lady Fortune. Your house can burn down, your goods can be stolen and destroyed, decay, break, and leave you unhappy without them. He doesn't think that it's absurd to speak of some happiness here in this life, but only if we use this life for the goal of that other one, all right? If we live in hope for eternal life, then we can be relatively happy in this life because we won't have put our hope for happiness in anything whose promise to make us happy can only be false. Even the life of virtue that the ancient philosophers pursued as supposedly the height of human happiness, even that, Augustine argues, is not true happiness in this life because the exercise of virtue is itself a kind of drudgery, and you only need it in the face of risks and obstacles that show that you're not perfectly happy. So think about courage, for example, which enables you to face danger and risk and to manage your fears. This is a great human achievement, and yet it is a drudgery to exercise because you're in danger and feeling fear. This is not a perfectly happy and tranquil enjoyment of peace, right? Think of temperance, the exercise of self-control in the face of overwhelming sensual desires for the pleasures of food and drink and sex and so on. This is a drudgery. Even if you manage to control yourself, you're constantly fighting against yourself and your impulses to self-destruction in your own self-indulgence. And he goes on with the other virtues as well, okay? So there's no real happiness in this life, but one can live in hope of a happiness in the next life. That's the city of God. The earthly city, or the city of man, is a city of self-love. Its members are those who live, as St. Paul says, according to the lusts of the flesh. They live for themselves in service of their own disordered desires. They don't order their lives and their deeds to God as an ultimate end. They live for the love of self to the contempt of God. They're pleasure seekers of various kinds, those who love honor or money, pleasure, power, or all of these in some combination. It doesn't have to be one. The point is that they love something else more than God, and it's themselves. Even the wise, the ancient philosophers, he argues, love really themselves, not the truth. And they live a kind of self-deception, a kind of affectation of total independence and self-sufficiency, the ability to be happy by their own efforts, which he thinks is a fool's errand. It's a myth. This life is the very antithesis of a life of obedience and reverent submission to God. That's the life of the earthly city, okay? So these two cities are mixed together in this life, and he doesn't think actually that you can ever know who the true members of each city are, because their members will be intermixed in any particular human community. He thinks it's impossible to know if a man is truly virtuous. We only see external actions. We see people's deeds, not the heart and its motives. He doesn't think that we can even plumb the depths of our own motives. Our own intentions can often be opaque and hidden even to ourselves. And so we can't even be certain if we ourselves act out of true virtue, all right? Nevertheless, he argues that it's only as members of the city of God that it's possible to attain true peace and happiness, the enjoyment of a good that could really satisfy us and without fear of loss of it. He thinks that's something to which all human beings aspire, but it's only as members of the city of God that they can attain it. So the city of God isn't meant to replace civil society, right? It's not like you're going to abolish any particular human city and replace it with the city of God. What it does is supplement every human society by providing different means to attain this highest end, the enjoyment of an infinite and immutable good, in other words, God. Civil society still has its role, it has its place, it orders temporal affairs, it orders material goods, and is able to achieve a kind of relative peace, he says, a relative peace. And that relative peace, that tranquility of order, he calls it, can be used as an instrument by the city of God for the pursuit of its own end, its own enjoyment of this perfect and infinite good. So that brings me to the question of the relationship between the two cities and the question of how pre- or anti-modern Augustine is on the one hand, or perhaps how proto-modern he is on the other. There are some interpreters who have called Augustine, for example, the first theorist of the secular realm. They see him as a real proto-modern, a real proto-secularist, because the program of the city of God could seem to be one of desacralizing the empire, desacralizing the state, right? Abandoning the pretensions for a political society built around virtue and the worship of the true God, and so on and so forth. On this way of reading Augustine, he would see any human society, any human polis or political community as neutral in relation to different conceptions of the good, different ultimate ends that each private individual might pursue. So we'd live together in common, in the common sphere, and use these neutral means, the material and temporal goods that the human city orders. We would use those means each for the pursuit of our own individual end. The members of the city of God use them to pursue the end of God, and other people might use them to pursue their own ends. We cooperate whenever our goals coincide. And Augustine would then come out as basically a proto-modern and Enlightenment thinker. I think this is entirely wrong. There is nothing proto or modern about Augustine's way of thinking at all. And I'd like to explain why in the last few minutes I have. So first of all, it's just not true for Augustine that the earthly city and its means are neutral. There are no neutral means for Augustine. It's not true that the earthly city lacks an ultimate end to which it's ordered, or some substantive good around which it is organized. Not at all. The earthly city, the city of man, does have an ultimate commitment, all right? It's the love of self to the exclusion of God, all right? And it does have a common end. It does have an ultimate destiny, eternal destruction, eternal punishment. That is the end to which he thinks the city of man is headed, all right? So he doesn't recognize any neutral means or any kind of neutral usefulness or utility of the things of this world. any use of the things of this world to wrong ends is an abuse, a misuse. So he's no kind of proto-modern, thinking that the earthly city is this neutral place where each person might pursue their own end. No, everyone is either pursuing self to the exclusion of God, or God even to the contempt of self. Okay, I'll end with a second way in which Augustine is decidedly anti-modern in his political thinking, and it's this, that he has no theory of social or political progress. No theory of social or political progress. There's no evidence in the City of God that Augustine hoped for a Christian transformation of human society or human culture, that he hoped eventually for the establishment of Christendom. This is not in Augustine's sights at all. Yes, he thinks that Christians will exercise political office and other offices of power differently from non-Christians. He thinks that husbands will treat their wives differently, that parents will treat their children differently, that masters will treat their slaves differently, emperors will treat their subjects differently if they're Christians. But all of those authority structures will remain in place. There's no radical transformation of authority structures in Augustine's sights. He thinks that those structures will only be undone when the entire world is undone at the end of time and remade, all right? There's a temptation here, other scholars have noted it, to excuse Augustine and to allow ourselves modernity, all right, because he hadn't seen what we've seen. He couldn't have imagined the radical transformations of society and of power structures that we have witnessed, such as the abolishment of slavery, all right? I mean, which was still a very long and slow and difficult process. I mean, some 500 years, and we have especially the English to thank for it. But I think that this temptation to excuse Augustine, to think, oh, he just hadn't seen what we've seen, and if he had, then he could perhaps have imagined and hoped for a radical transformation of human society. I think that that temptation is to be resisted. I think it's a mistake, because it ignores the real difference between us and those of our time and Augustine. If we have that kind of optimism and that hope for social transformation and that belief in social malleability, it's because we've been formed by the revolutionary traditions of the Enlightenment. This is the real difference between us. Augustine did have a strong sense of historical development. He was aware of radical changes in society and in power structures, but he found them inherently ambiguous, and he distanced himself from them as a result, all right? Yes, God let Rome conquer the world. Yes, the church can use the relative peace of Rome for its mission in the world, but the history of Rome is a demonic history, Augustine thinks. It's driven by the lust for power and glory. And God's role in it is a kind of hidden providence, right? God uses the folly of men for his own good purposes, right? For his own higher ends. And in the case of Rome, it was, at least in Augustine's time, to bring the pretensions of the proud Romans low, right? To bring them to naught, all right? So why doesn't Augustine trust in the hope for human progress, though? His main reason, I think, for being so doubtful of the hope for human progress is the hiddenness of the human heart. This is the last point I want to make. He says, we experience peace as an insecure good because we do not know the hearts of those with whom we wish to establish peace. Augustine is vexed by the difficulty that we have in displaying the contents of our hearts to others and in knowing what lies in theirs, right? This casts a shadow over all human and social relations. We can be deceived in one another. Empire, because it unites us, makes us think that this constraint, that this part of the human condition is overcome, but it's not. It's not. Our motives remain ever private, and this vitiates community. It vitiates cooperation at every level. There's no community that you could form that would be immune from human stupidity immune from human treachery, immune from human selfishness, immune from human vanity, immune from the conflicts of views and opinions and the wish to have it one's own way. So to be vexed by these kinds of things, I think, is to see the limits of any merely human and earthly endeavor, any merely human and earthly city. And it's those kinds of questions that I want to leave you with, because they are the test, you might say, about whether you can accept Augustine's political view or not. Are you troubled by what your kids are thinking? Are you troubled by the fact that your husband or wife may be sleeping with your best friend? Are you troubled by the realization that our prisons may be full of innocent people? All you can do is trust the testimony of the people in the courts and do your best to work against human falsity, but often it is in vain. To be vexed by these kinds of questions is to see the limits of the earthly city, of the city of man, and to begin to long for something more is already to begin to be a member of the city of God. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Terry. This brilliant stuff. All I want to do here, following up from this, is to move into the 20th century and to note how two of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, Sigmund Freud and Ludwig Wittgenstein, employed the image of the city to illuminate aspects of their thought. In Freud's case, the nature of the mind, and in Wittgenstein's case, the nature of language. I'll do this very simply and straightforwardly, just by presenting to you a couple of passages from each thinker. Both Freud and Wittgenstein, by the way, were products of the same great city, Vienna. And at a particularly odd and imaginative time in its history, Karl Kraus, another of the great Viennese writers of the time, called Vienna during this period, I quote, a research laboratory for world destruction. It's an incredible phrase, a research laboratory for world destruction. I might wish to apply that description to another place, another country somewhat closer to home. Krauss, by the way, is an absolutely brilliant user of language. He described psychoanalysis in this Freud's great invention of psychoanalysis was described by Krauss as the disease of which it should be the cure, which is a really great summary of things. Anyway, I want to think about the ideas of Freud and Wittgenstein, both of which emerged from this Viennese cauldron. There are significant connections to be drawn between Wittgenstein and Freud, in addition to their Viennese home. This is not remarked upon enough, but Wittgenstein was hugely influenced by Freud, and in one place referred to himself as, I quote Wittgenstein, I am a disciple of Freud. This shows itself most, I think, in his later philosophical method, which is modeled upon the method of psychoanalysis. Wittgenstein here treats philosophical problems as something akin to neuroses. He calls this philosophy somewhere, it's in Remarks on the Foundations of Mathematics, as a sickness of the understanding. Philosophy is a sickness of the understanding. And in another place, in Philosophical Investigations, his greatest work, Wittgenstein says, the philosopher's treatment of a question is like the treatment of an illness. The philosopher's treatment of a question is like the treatment of an illness. For what it's worth, I agree with that. Anyway, that stuff about philosophy as somehow sort of neurotic is a story for another day. We're thinking today about the city. So what I want to do is just look at a couple of passages that I want us to focus on. We'll start with Freud. Ever concerned to make his ideas clear to his audience, Freud sought memorable and illuminating analogies. And on one occasion, more than one occasion, found these in the imagery of a city. Two examples of this. It will be known that Freud's great invention, psychoanalysis, has its roots in his treatment of cases of hysteria. In hysteria, it's a diagnosis no longer made by mental health professionals, by the way, we find a range of symptoms, including breathlessness, fits, absences, eating disorders, disorders of speech, paralysis of limbs, etc., which are not the result of organic disease or damage. Freud and his collaborator Joseph Breuer suggested that these hysterical symptoms were the result of traumatic events or fantasies which the hysteric, in an act of self-defense, had banished from consciousness. These banished mental contents had been, in other words, repressed. The key word in psychoanalysis, of course, is repression. Now unconscious, these repressed ideas, seeking some kind of discharge, express themselves via the production of hysterical symptoms. Here's one rather small-scale example of how this happened. Among the symptoms endured by Anna O, the founding patient of psychoanalysis, Anna O suffered from a profound hydrophobia or disgust at drinking water. Breuer traces this back to an unpleasant event in Anna's social life. One day, a lady companion of hers paid a visit and allowed her little dog, that Anna refers to as a horrid creature, to drink out of Anna's best china. Anna, polite to a T, swallows her disgust, represses it, and from that moment on cannot drink water. This is a fairly banal example. Breuer provides better and nastier ones, but I don't want to ruin your afternoon. Deeply unpleasant. But you get the idea. The point is that the symptom, the hydrophobia, is the result of a traumatic memory of something that has been repressed and dammed up and then explodes via a symptom. This, of course, is the foundation for Freud's theory of dreams, which we haven't got time to talk about. But the most famous line of the studies on hysteria, Freud and Breuer's great book, summarizes this. Hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences. Hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences. Okay. Now, when Freud took his first and only trip to the United States, which was a country he heartily disliked, by the way, he delivered a series of lectures on psychoanalysis at Clack University in Massachusetts. And when he came to describe the mind of the hysteric, he used the example of a city, and particularly the city of London. You're going to forgive me, because this is what you're supposed never to do with PowerPoint, which is to put a load of text. And you've got a load of text up here. Don't worry about it. There aren't tests after this. I'll read through it. Hysterical patients suffer from reminiscences. Their symptoms are residues and mnemic symbols, mnemic relating to memory, of particular traumatic experiences. We may perhaps obtain a deeper understanding of this kind of symbolism if we compare them with other mnemic symbols in other fields. The monuments and memorials with which large cities are adorned are also mnemic symbols. There's a great way of thinking about these. They're symbols of memories, of collective memories. If you take a walk through the streets of London, you will find in front of one of the great railway termini a richly carved Gothic column, Charing Cross. It's kind of peculiar because when I spoke a couple of weeks ago about Samuel Johnson, we focused on Charing Cross there as this place where you would encounter the full tide of human existence. Anyway, Freud goes on. One of the old Plantagenet kings of the 13th century ordered the body of his beloved Queen Eleanor to be carried to Westminster, and at every stage at which the coffin rested, he erected a Gothic cross. Charing Cross is the last of the monuments that commemorate the funeral cortege. It's interesting, the name Charing, in Charing Cross, appears to be derived from the French Chère, or Dear Queen, which is quite lovely. The cross of the Dear Queen. And another point in the same town, not far from London Bridge, you'll find a towering and more modern column, which is simply known as the Monument. Some of you may have been here. It was designed as a memorial of the Great Fire, which broke out in that neighbourhood in 1666 and destroyed a large part of the city. These monuments then resemble hysterical symptoms in being mnemic symbols. Up to that point, the comparison seems justifiable. But what should we think of a Londoner who paused today in deep melancholy before the memorial of Queen Eleanor's funeral, instead of going about his business in the hurry that modern working conditions demand? Or instead of feeling joy over the youthful queen of his own heart? Or again, what should we think of a Londoner who shed tears before the monument that commemorates the reduction of his beloved metropolis to ashes, although it has long since risen again in far greater brilliance? Yet every single hysteric and neurotic behaves like one of these two unpractical Londoners. Not only do they remember painful experiences of the remote past, but they still cling to them emotionally. This is the key phrase. They cannot get free of the past, and for its sake they neglect what is real and immediate. This fixation of mental life to pathogenic traumas is one of the most significant and practically important characteristics of neurosis. You know, if nothing else, this should make you see what a great writer, what a great stylist Freud was. I do think students are really missing out now as a result of not habitually reading Freud because he's gone so out of fashion. Students don't read Freud unless they're in my classes when they really have to. So fixation on the past, the active presence of the remote past in our daily lives, all of this Freud illuminated by reference to a city's memorials, plaques, and commemorative statues. So here Freud is thinking of the mind as itself a kind of city. And in a later work, he's still interested in this analogy. If you go to the brilliant Civilization and Its Discontents from 1930, Freud uses the example of Rome to show how the temporal contents of our minds, thoughts and ideas relating to what is present, to what has just happened, nestles side by side with experiences from our own remote past, from our infancy and childhood. So like many major cities, and certainly old ones, Rome has a long and a rich history. From a series of Bronze Age hill settlements, it developed over time into the bustling metropolis we see today. There are many layers of history in a city like Rome, and we can see these side by side if we pay a visit. Ancient sites like the Colosseum, the Forum, and Pantheon sit close by modern buildings, fast food restaurants, banks, and so on. Freud then asks us to imagine Rome not as a physical place, but as the human mind. He says, now let us make the fantastic supposition that Rome were not a human dwelling place, but a mental entity with just as long and varied a past history, that is, in which nothing once constructed had perished, and all the earlier stages of development had survived alongside the latest. This is an important passage, and here we get that dramatic Freudian vision of the human mind in which our past is never gone and never leaves us, and in which our individual histories influence and sometimes determine our futures. We may be adults now, but we share our interior lives with our past selves. That 4-year-old boy excluded from its parents' mysterious bedroom, the 5th grader praised or chastised by their teacher, the teenager experiencing for the first time heartbreak. All of that stuff is still there, all as alive as it ever was, ready to come out again. And there are, alongside these, many more ghosts of ourselves haunting us. And it was in the phenomenon of the city that Freud found this most perfectly represented, pasts living alongside present. This reminds me of an insight expressed in an entirely non-psychoanalytic way by the great historian Sir George Trevelyan, when Trevelyan, in a lovely passage in his autobiography, speaks of the allure of the past to the historian. Trevelyan says, the poetry of history lies in the quasi-miraculous fact that once, on this earth, once, on this familiar spot of ground, walked other men and women, as actual as we are today, thinking their own thoughts, swayed by their own passions, but now all gone, one generation vanishing after another, gone as utterly as we ourselves shall shortly be gone, like ghosts at cockcrow. Now that's beautiful. To live in a city is to live among ghosts. And now a quick word about Wittgenstein. What distinguishes Wittgenstein's early philosophy? Every philosophy freshman student knows that Wittgenstein has an early philosophy and a later philosophy, and these are in contradistinction to each other. And the difference lies in part in an attitude towards generalities. In the early work, Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, Wittgenstein had sought what he called the general form of the proposition, or the general form of language. And this he located in its pictorial quality. Now, the function of language for Wittgenstein then was to depict factual situations in the world. He says, the general form of the proposition is, this is how things stand. Things are thus and so. Now, in the later philosophical investigations, the search for the general form of language, or the general form of anything, is abandoned. Here, what is emphasized is difference and variety. I think really one of the most inspiring parts of Wittgenstein's later philosophy is just how often he uses the word sometimes. An underutilized word, and a very important one, sometimes. So time and again in Wittgenstein's later philosophy, we encounter his great emphasis on the varied character of language. Unlike in the Tractatus, he is not trying to uncover the general form of language, but is rather intent on surveying all of the different forms that language takes. This finds explicit expression in paragraph 23 of Philosophical Investigations, when he says, but how many kinds of sentence are there? Say, assertion, question, and command. There are countless kinds, countless different kinds of use of all the things we call signs, words, sentences. And this diversity is not something fixed, given once for all, but new types of language, new language games, as we may say, come into existence, and others become obsolete and get forgotten. So, language, Wittgenstein thinks, is ever-changing, new bits being added, and old bits falling into disrepair and being swept away. And of course, an appropriate analogy for this is precisely a city. It is indeed the image of language that Wittgenstein presents to us. He says in paragraph 18 of the Investigations, our language can be regarded as an ancient city, a maze of little streets and squares of old and new houses, of houses with extensions from various periods, and all this surrounded by a multitude of new suburbs with straight and regular streets and uniform houses. I mean, look, we can see this variety even in San Diego, which is hardly an ancient city. There are parts of this city designed for a commercial purpose, the high-rise office buildings downtown. There are parts that have a more residential focus, and then you can compare the differences in residing in North Park versus residing in Sunset Cliffs. Different ways of living and being there. There are parts that are designed for entertainment, Gaslamp Quarter, for example, and the very different entertainments that the beach communities offer. On the outskirts of the city, if you go up to around UCSD, for example, we find those new developments dedicated to science and technology and innovation. And all these have markedly different characters, variety. Wittgenstein's point is that language possesses this type of variety too. No uniformity. Think about the very different discourses of science, of religion, poetry, sports, and so on. And there is that temporal dimension here too, that thing that Freud and Trevelyan also alert us to. Those newer districts of language have their shiny and conspicuous words. Megabyte, screen share, app, chatbot, and so on. I might say every single one of those words is awful. But the old neighborhoods of language remain, and in them we have a distinct set of antique words and ideas, actually more beautiful ideas: fate, bewitchment, soul, God, shade, ghost. A lovely, haunting remark found in Wittgenstein's Remarks on Fraser's Golden Bough might here be quoted. He says, I love this line, "A whole mythology is deposited in our language." A whole mythology is deposited in our language. Even the days of the week, Wednesday, the day of Wotan, that the gods are present in the days of the week. It's quite remarkable and very, very moving. Anyway, all I've done here is try to highlight the idea of the city in Freud and Wittgenstein, and the place that the image of the city has in their respective thinking. In so doing, though, we also bring to prominence some beautiful thoughts about the nature of the city. From Freud, we get the palimpsestic quality of the city, the layering of those structures, one on top of the other, simply side by side, stretching back and back and back through the years, time out of mind. And from Wittgenstein, we get that gorgeous idea of pluralism. The city is great variety. What it exhibits in that variety, diversity of manners, cultures and neighborhoods. And we can link that idea, of course, again back to something we noted from Samuel Johnson a couple of weeks ago with regard to the richness of city life. Johnson famously said, "The city is inhabited by people of different customs and contrary opinions, and I may hope there to find variety in life." So in each of our talks today, we've highlighted the richness, I hope, of the idea of the city and how that richness was used imaginatively by a range of rather different thinkers. It's right on 5:20, but I'm happy to have an extension of 5 minutes just to take 2 questions in for the 2, possibly 3 of us. So thank you very much. Questions, please.